An ordained minister has decided to give up God for a year.
How the heck do you just up and become atheist after being a pastor?
What I'm most worried about right now is figuring out how I can live openly and honestly.
I am finally free to be me.
I have no idea how to find friends or become a part of a community that's not religious.
What does life look like after church, after religion, after God?
That's it in a nutshell.
This is the Life After God podcast, a conversation on the space between belief and unbelief and beyond, with your host, Ryan Bell.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Life After God podcast. My name is Ryan Bell, and I'm your host. This is episode 93. My guest today is Chris Stedman. Chris is a writer, speaker, and community organizer living in Minneapolis. His new book, out tomorrow from Broadleaf Books, is called IRL, Finding Realness, Meaning, and Belonging in Our Digital Lives. The IRL in the title refers to the internet shorthand for in real life, in contrast to our online lives. But Chris thinks this designation is a mistake. Much of the time, Chris says, we don't think of our time on the internet as real, and therefore we don't approach it with the same critical analysis that we might a different kind of engagement. How much thought do you put into an activity that you don't think is real? Chris argues that while our lives online are different than other relational spaces, it's no less real. As such, he invites us to think deeply and critically about how we engage with the internet, how it is shaping us, and what it's telling us about what is real and what is important. A couple of weeks has gone by since we recorded this conversation, and Chris's book is due out tomorrow, October 20. The timing of the release of this conversation allows me to insert a note here about a piece that was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine this week, dated October 13, entitled The Problem of Free Speech in an Age of Disinformation. I highly recommend it. In the latter half of our conversation, I asked Chris about the problems facing our society from online disinformation and hate speech. I put the link to the article in the show notes so that you can check it out for yourself. As is germane to the topic of our conversation, I initially met Chris on the internet, but finally had a chance to meet him in person when he was the humanist chaplain at Yale when I spoke there in 2015. Since then, we've kept up online, on Twitter, and so forth, and it's a real privilege to share this conversation with you. As always, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your support for the show. I love these conversations, and I love sharing them with you and hearing your reactions. So if you want to share your thoughts with me, please write to me at ryan@lifeaftergod.org. If you're new to the show, it's important that you know that this podcast is made possible by the generous support of over 80 listeners who contribute anywhere from $1 to $50 a month to make it possible. A huge shout out to all of you who contribute or have contributed in the past. I want to especially thank my dear friend Nathan Watkins, who is an investor on the show. Thank you so much, all of you, for helping me keep this show going, especially now during these challenging times. Some folks have understandably needed to take a step back, so if you're doing okay and you've been thinking about becoming a member for a while, I would be so grateful. All you need to do is visit patreon.com/lifeaftergod to set up a monthly recurring donation of anywhere from $1 to as much as you think this podcast is worth. And also, and this is totally free, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever app you use and leave me a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps the show reach a higher profile. Okay, enough about all of that. Let's get to this conversation with Chris Stedman. Chris Stedman, welcome to the Life After God podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh man, it's such a pleasure. How are you? How are things?
I'm good. It's a beautiful day here in Minnesota, so I can't complain. And I'm really excited to be doing this show. I feel like it's a long time in the making.
It's true. I feel the same way. Funny thing about you mentioned Minnesota real quick, and I'll probably edit this out, but maybe not. I read an article in ProPublica the other day that was talking about the effects of climate change and where sort of the sweet spot for agriculture.
I was reading that same thing, yeah.
And pretty soon you guys are going to be like, in about 50 years, you're going to be the heartland.
I know, yeah. It was. I was looking at that too, and I got here early.
Yeah.
Or got here, I guess.
Yeah, I told my girlfriend we should buy property, go finally, in my adult life, maybe own a home one day. And we should, go up there, Wisconsin, Minnesota, because, by the time my kids would inherit it from me, it would be like, prime real estate.
Totally. But let's be honest, they're projecting 50 years right now, but I'm sure it'll be sooner than that.
Right. Yeah. The way things are going, the West Coast will be entirely uninhabitable in 20.
Yeah.
Well,
on that cheery note.
Yeah, exactly. Yay.
You doing okay out there?
Yeah, we're hanging in. It's the skies in Pasadena have cleared. We have a fire that's really close to us, and by really close, I mean like 10 miles.
Sure.
Which is like certainly not close enough to threaten our safety, but the air has been horrible for 2 weeks. And just yesterday, I went and sat in my patio outside for the first time in 2 weeks.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah, and it was just, I was telling someone else that it feels like, the virus made the world much smaller in terms of my sort of inhabitable world. We couldn't go places. We decided not to go places. But we could still go outside. In fact, it was encouraged, go outside, take walks. And then the heat hit 2 weeks ago, and it was over 110 for 3 days here. And we just stayed inside. And then the smoke came, inside the house, through the windows and under the crack in the door. And it felt like claustrophobia, like all of these calamities were just closing in, one tighter than the one before. But we have a little relief now, so that's good. Good.
I'm glad.
Well, my first acquaintance with you came when you published your first book, and we're going to talk here in a few minutes about your second book that's coming out in just a few weeks. But I want to go back before we talk about your new book to sort of the origin story, the beginning of Chris Stedman as a public intellectual and as a writer. Because it's so relevant to the subject of this podcast, Life After God, in which I often interview people who no one would know necessarily except for their family and close friends, just ordinary folks who ran into the limits of their religious worldview and decided to make some kind of change or another, whether it's becoming an atheist or somewhere in between. And in your first book, you talk about your sort of decision to step away from your upbringing. It was a pretty painful experience for you. That book is called Faithiest, and I know probably many of our listeners have read that book. But just in case some people haven't heard of you or haven't heard of that book, tell us a little bit about your growing up experience and what it was like being in an evangelical context for you.
Yeah, so I think people are sometimes surprised, or at least this has been my experience among like atheists and humanists and secular folks, because, so in my early childhood growing up, we were really, what social scientists and demographers who study religion in the United States, we were what they call religiously unaffiliated. We were just nuns, NONESs. We weren't sort of explicitly secular or atheistic or anything, but we weren't religious either. I always say that I didn't hear the word God in my household growing up, but I didn't hear the word atheist either. We just were sort of nothing.
Yeah.
But then when I was 11, I had a conversion and I became an evangelical. And, the sort of quick and dirty version of that story is that about a year prior to converting, I started reading books like Alex Haley's Roots and John Hershey's Hiroshima and Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. So I kind of immersed myself in these works that not only increased my awareness of some of the greatest atrocities in the history of human civilization, but also told the stories of what it was like for people who experienced those things. And I felt like I'd learned about some of those events in school, but really they were just sort of presented as historical facts, as things that had happened. But they weren't sort of I couldn't feel them in the same way that I did when I read those stories, and reading those sort of filled me with this immense kind of existential angst, as much as a 10-year-old can feel existential angst. And I just, I found myself completely confounded by the fact that I lived in a world where people could be, and of course, some of my naivete had to do with my own privileged, upbringing as a white cisgender man in a society where life is much easier and where the world sort of caters to the desires and worldviews of white cisgender men. So, it was sort of an awakening of my own ignorance, but I found myself just completely disturbed by the fact that people could be so inhumane toward one another. And I wanted to understand why. I wanted to understand what it means to be human, if being human encompasses this. And I felt like I didn't have a space where I could do that. I didn't even really have the language to begin articulating those questions. But I was invited around 11 to this non-denominational evangelical Christian after-school youth group in my town. I was enticed by the sort of allure of free pizza, but I, when I got there, I found a community of people who were equally obsessed with these kinds of questions, who wanted to understand, what it means to be human, what our responsibility is when in terms of the injustices that we see in the world, who wanted to try and make sense of those things. And so even though, the idea of God was like unfamiliar and confusing, I was like, these are my people. These are my people because they care about the things that I care about. And of course that they also, the particular community I converted into was, extremely anti-gay, and this conversion coincided with my emerging recognition of my own gayness, and so it was a deeply it ended up being a deeply fraught experience for me. But those questions, who am I? How do I understand myself, the world around me? How do I engage with the world around me? How do I respond to injustice? Those are the questions that ultimately sort of drove me into religion, and that have really, I think, guided my entire life ever since. And even in the sort of, I look back on that community that I converted into, and I see many deep problems, and I also, attribute it to a lot of challenges that I faced. But I also, I appreciate at very minimum, that it was a space that affirmed the importance of those questions, that said, those questions that you have, they're important questions, they matter. And you're not wrong to care about them. So I do appreciate that.
Well, and listening to you tell that story again, I can, easily see the through line to, what you're doing today. And hopefully by the end of this conversation, people will see that as well. And it really resonates for me. My background is a little different in that I was raised in a sort of fundamentalist, kind of an odd evangelical-ish religion, in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So my sort of, quest to become, a Christian myself was really, seeded by my parents and my grandparents' involvement in the church, unlike your sort of discovery as a young person yourself on, basically on your own. But a lot of the things that drove me, I think, were very similar. I think I was a similarly inquisitive, sort of thoughtful, philosophical kid, like it sounds like you were. So along the way,
not always thoughtful, but but definitely, definitely introspective. And of course, what I sort of realized later is that, it's not as if my sort of deep desire to make sense of injustice was sort of purely altruistic. On some level, some subconscious level, I understood that there was something about me that was also different, that also put me at risk of alienation. And so my desire to understand those things was also kind of self-preservation, although I didn't realize it at the time. The irony, right, was that it ended up sort of driving me into a community that made it that much harder at the time for me to accept myself and to find acceptance from others. But
yeah, that didn't really assist you in your quest in the end.
No, it didn't. I mean, ultimately, I'm very fortunate because I spent several years really struggling with my sexual orientation once I had converted into this community. And to the point where, the irony is I became a Christian because I was trying to make sense of injustice and find a sense of community and belonging. And instead, struggling so immensely with my sexual orientation, I really retreated within myself, and my own my own suffering increased really significantly. But I was very fortunate because a number of years into that process, my mother sort of noticing something was amiss, that I had gone from a very kind of gregarious, outgoing child to someone very withdrawn and morose. She found a journal that I was sort of hiding in the back of my closet, and she read it. And so she read, what I was struggling with. And, my mother was not a Christian. She didn't really know sort of how to support me best in what I was struggling with. And so she went to the phone book. This, will tell you a little bit about my age, but she went to the phone book. She called up local churches in the community. And because we were in Minnesota, the odds were not small that she was going to find a Lutheran church. And so she ended up calling a Lutheran church, talking to a minister there who was LGBT affirming. And she took me to speak with him the next day. And that not only was exactly the right thing to do in that situation, because I needed someone who could offer me another frame within Christianity to begin sort of rethinking what I was struggling with. But it also set me sort of on the path that ultimately, I've gone down. So I ended up becoming involved in Lutheran communities that were LGBT affirming. I found that kind of community of like-minded people who were interested in the same questions that I was, who also, helped me come to terms with who I was and embrace that. But as a result, I ended up going to a Lutheran college to study religion, thinking that, I might go into the ministry myself to kind of help people who were trying to make sense of their own identities and the world around them, like Lutheran ministers, like the one my mom had brought me to, had helped me during a critical moments. But it was there at a Lutheran college that I, studied religion and was challenged by my religion professors, all of whom were Christian, to really ask myself why I believed the things that I believed and why I had become a Christian in the first place. And through that process, I came to recognize that for me, it had been about the function more so than the theology. The theology I'd kind of always I felt like I took it on as a package deal. It was like, these are the questions that drive me. The other people who are driven by these questions all sort of cite God as a part of why they care and how they make sense of it. And so even though that doesn't necessarily sort of make sense to me or resonate with my own experience, I'll sort of, obviously, I'm the only one here who seems to have a question about it. So I'll just kind of go along with it. But my professors, and it's been so fun and strange. I'm now teaching in that same department. So I teach in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at the same school that I attended as an undergraduate. And I'm teaching alongside many of the people who played this sort of pivotal role for me. But so I'm eternally grateful that they not only sort of welcomed my questions, but really challenged me to ask ones that even I was afraid to ask, because I worried that this sense of identity and belonging that I had found in Christianity would be threatened by those questions. And ultimately, I guess my fear was right, but I'm grateful that I ended up in communities that valued the pursuit of knowledge, of understanding of truth, and encouraged me to follow that path, even if that path led me out of that same tradition.
Yeah, it's like, I so kind of feel the pathos of what you're saying, that it's like almost like multiple alienations, like feeling alienated from yourself initially and confused by that, and then joining a community where you might find yourself and then feeling alienated from that community. And it's just, I feel like so many people go through that experience of looking for that, and we'll come to this in the discussion about your new book, understanding who am I and what's what's real, what's authentic, what's worth putting my soul into, if I can use that word. And it's so hard to find. Like I'm nearly 50 now, and I'm still, I'm still finally trying to find like my place. And in your book, Faithiest, you talk about, your work with Interfaith Youth Corps and your discovery of interfaith communities as well. And also your discovery that some atheists, as you had recently sort of identified yourself, also didn't have that sense of community and sort of earnest searching for truth that you were looking for either. So that was that another alienation along the way?
It was, yeah. I wasn't, when I finally did find, sort of my community of humanists and atheists, people who really, did share my worldview. It was a struggle to recognize, when I sort of recognized that, even there, we weren't all sort of driven by the same values. It's actually, you talk about being, almost 50, I'm in my 30s now, and, I've been doing this work for so long, and it's still amazing to me, all the new things I can learn about myself and my motivations. And so, this year, at the beginning of the year, I began dating someone who is 1 year away from becoming an Episcopal priest, which has been,
wow.
It's funny because when the relationship started, a bunch of my friends were like, oh, this is the least surprising thing ever. And I'm like, excuse me, actually, I've never dated a religious person before, if you can believe it. Literally every boyfriend I've ever had has been non-religious like me. But I thought about it, because we obviously have a lot of conversations about these things, he and I. And it's occurred to me that, so many of the guys I've dated in the past have been non-religious like me, but they've been in that sort of nuns category, the NONESs. They are not religious, but they don't particularly care one way or another. They haven't really thought about it a ton. They were always, supportive of what I do and my interests, but they didn't, in the same way that evangelical community I converted into when I was younger affirmed that these questions, they matter. They have a real sort of bearing on how we live in the world. And they, they sort of shared my interest in those questions. That's a similarity that he and I have, even if we sort of have arrived at different working conclusions about them. He sees the questions as mattering in the same way that I do. And so ultimately, that's why I've not only found community among humanists and atheists and have found people who share a lot of my values there, but I also, as you say, have found community in interfaith spaces where, not only can we learn from each other and work to, break down some of the stigmas that exist between our communities, but we can also surround ourselves with people who, are going to challenge us, who are going to, put new ways of seeing things to us, and who also share something really important, which is a sense that, these aren't just trivial questions. These things really do matter. So, I have experienced alienation, as you say, but I've also found a great sense of belonging in both humanist spaces and interfaith spaces, and I've been grateful for that.
So I guess take us from those experiences and the subject of your first book to what led you to the subject of this new book.
Obviously, we, as you said, there's sort of this first book and then this second book, the new one that's coming out. And when it was announced, I remember, people being like, okay, I don't really follow, like, what's the link here between this book about atheism and interfaith dialogue and this book about the internet. But I really think our conversation today is sort of exactly what ultimately led me to be interested in the subject of the second book, which is that, my story of sort of leaving a religious institution and kind of making my way out into this sort of uncharted territory, or at least sort of disorganized territory of kind of being religiously unaffiliated, but still being interested in questions of meaning and purpose, which is also your story. I think I started to recognize that, we're leaving these institutions. more and more people are leaving these religious institutions, but we're not sort of institutionless. Instead, many of us are sort of we're migrating that work from, the work that has kind of historically happened in churches. The reason I ended up in a church was because I was sort of interested in that. We're moving that work, a lot of it, to the internet. Right. At least for me, the internet is a huge part of where I have found a sense of connection and community, where I found other humanists. You and I connected online. And
I love trying to explain to my girlfriend how I know someone that I'm talking about. She'll say, "Who is that?" And I'm like, "Oh, and I'll say the person's name and oh, how do you know them?" I'm like, "Oh, this is always the question." Like, right. I met them online. I don't know,
right.
Through this weird, totally. Journey that we've both been on.
And I think that, because for so much of our lives, we have, at least I, and I think many others, have viewed the internet as sort of like not real life, or at least sort of less real. It's this kind of like space where we go to share things about the life that we're actually living somewhere else. Even though we've, if we actually look at our behavior, we've been very obviously like doing things that really matter, that are very real, forging meaningful connections, expressing ourselves, finding resources, connecting with other people. All the things that, again, I sort of found in church when I was younger. It's very obvious that we've been doing those things online. But I think, just like when I left religion, my needs, the needs that I was sort of meeting in religion didn't just disappear, right? I still had a need for a sense of belonging, for a sense of community and connection. I think just because we sort of act as if, or have been told that the internet is sort of not real life. It's not exactly the same as, which it isn't the same exactly as other parts of our lives, but it's sort of less real, or a space, just because that's sort of the message that we've gotten doesn't mean that we don't bring those same needs to our digital lives. And so over the course of, the last 4 years, I kind of decided to see if that really was the case, if we really were kind of trying to meet these needs online, and if so, sort of how we're doing so, whether or not it's working, and what we can learn from that. And so in my mind, and I hope that the connection sort of comes through to people who read the book, but in my mind, those things are very connected. I've been I worked as a chaplain for the better part of a decade. And so my job was to accompany people as they were exploring these big questions in their lives and trying to make sense of them. Not to give them answers, obviously, because I definitely don't have those, but to help them carve out space in their lives for those questions. And I think we need to, at least I've felt this need to carve out space in my digital life, to like step back and actually ask myself, in what ways am I meeting those needs online, and what does that sort of reveal about those needs that I have? And I think it's, what I learned is that the internet presents immense challenges, but also so many opportunities to think about those things, about what it means to be a person, and to be a person in a context, and all of those kinds of things.
Just listening to you talk, a story came to mind that I haven't thought about in a very long time, which is my departure from high school on my way to college. And I was in a very fundamentalist family, but it felt positive to me. It didn't feel oppressive at all. And I was very excited to be going to a Christian college, a Seventh-day Adventist college up in Central California. And I was at a public high school where I was constantly, a misfit for everything that was happening there, whether it was Sabbath observance that interrupted my ability to participate in, traditional coming-of-age events like prom or football games. I was really happy to be going to a Christian college, and my grandfather pulled me aside on more than one occasion and said, just remember that your experience there will be whatever you bring to it, like whatever you decide for it to be. Like, don't think that just because you're going to a Christian college, everyone's going to share your values. And sure enough, I mean, he was very right. And I don't necessarily think I had the optimal experience of that college. I think I was, terribly confused about a lot of things, which shaped my experience of those couple of years. But it's absolutely true that it wasn't so much the space I was in as the person I was coming into that space and what I was looking for. And I found in very, very, in many ways, I found what I was looking for. And I feel like, when I read your book, that the internet is very, and anything is actually that way. Like if you go on Tinder or Grindr, or you go on, Nextdoor app or Facebook, or you go out into your neighborhood, in as we say, in real life, which we'll hopefully talk about a little bit more, you'd still find what you're looking for, right? Like if you want to find a group of people to get drunk with every night, they're there. You can find them. If you want to find a book club to discuss issues with, people, you'll find that. And so it seems to me that anytime a new technology comes along, whether it's radio, television, video, the cable networks that exploded our television dial to hundreds of channels, there are always these sort of doom and gloom predictions that it's going to destroy our way of life as it's always been. And we seem to find a way to adapt to it. Is that your experience of the internet as well? And what your research that you did was that it's more like what we do with what we have rather than the thing itself?
Absolutely. I mean, I think so. It's kind of both and, right? Like, so there's always been alarmists at any sort of new technological innovation. I mean, there was all kinds of doom and gloom when the printing press came to be, but that doesn't mean that there's not, every change, every sort of immense change like this, there is a swirl of loss and gain. I mean, yes, the printing press enabled, an explosion of knowledge, the spread of, and yet it had there were real impacts on oral traditions, and there was loss there, right? Like the way that knowledge is transferred from person to person versus from text to person. And the book tries to sort of be really honest about the fact that, we're in this immense transitional moment culturally from a pre-digital age to a digital one. And that there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also a lot of loss, and there are also immense challenges that we face. A lot of the end of the book sort of deals with the fact that the platforms that we use now to connect with others, to express ourselves, to understand ourselves better, are driven first and foremost by the demands of profit. And so, they're not, they don't have an interest about what kind of experience we're having online. They don't care if it's an experience that is connective, that helps us forge meaningful connections and understand ourselves better. As long as we are using it, that's sort of all they care about. And there was, I cite in the book this longitudinal, I think it was an 8-year longitudinal study out of BYU that found that, that sort of challenges the common thinking right now, which is that more time online makes you lonelier, more narcissistic, all the sort of doom and gloom that we see about the internet. And so this study suggested that two people could spend the same exact amount of time online, but have radically different experiences, and that it has sort of everything to do with how you're using the internet. So if you're sort of, and in the book, I talk about the difference between deep play and shallow play. Mm-hmm. Deep play is sort of creative, experimental, connective. It gives you, it's like the imagination games of my childhood. It gives you opportunities to experiment with identity, to connect with others. Shallow play is like a slot machine. You're sort of driven by impulse. You keep coming back, chasing that high.
That dopamine hit.
Exactly. And we've all had that experience online, driven by the algorithm. But I was doing plenty of doom scrolling the other night when RBG died. And so the platforms definitely, there is, it's easier to drive, use by fear, by anger. But someone who is using the internet sort of intentionally, who is, being mindful about it, can spend the same amount of time online and not, have an increase in anxiety and in fact, it can be a space for deep play, for that kind of connective, reflective play. But that's harder. I mean, it's like climate change, right? Like individual changes can make a big difference in our lives, but we also need systemic change. It doesn't matter how much I recycle if these major corporations that account for the majority of pollution, of pollution, aren't checked by the system. And so, as much as, and I think we have real power to be able to have an impact on what our experience is like online right now, individually, by making sort of particular choices and by trying to be intentional and mindful. But the odds are kind of stacked against us until these platforms change. And under capitalism, they are first and foremost going to prioritize what makes themselves money. And
right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking, a whole few minutes ago, as you started into this sort of line of reasoning, which I really appreciate, I thought again of Marshall McLuhan's book, The Medium is the Message, and the way that the medium isn't passive. It does shape the discourse. And it really requires what I hear you saying, and like to get your take on this, that what really is required of us is that we engage thoughtfully with whatever we do. So if you just, going back several generations to a new technology like television, if you just plop down in front of it and turn on, I don't know, one of the broadcast network news channels like, NBC, and you watch the nightly news every night for a year, you're going to have a particular view of what's going on in the world.
Exactly.
It may even be partly true, or even all true, but it's not all the truth. It's only the truth that they.
It's not neutral. Even
right.
There is no such thing as neutral journalism, because even the stories that you choose to tell or not tell are, they reflect certain values, what you see as being noteworthy and important.
Right, exactly. And I think, and then, in terms of the medium, television kind of is a passive exercise where, reading is a little bit more active. And so I think just being aware that this is what's shaping us. And I know Noam Chomsky's helped me think about this a lot, and the way that propaganda works, and how we can consume things, but to be intentional about what we're consuming and recognize the limitations of it, and where it may not give you the whole picture, I think is really helpful. And I've used social media really differently than I used to use it. I primarily use Twitter to keep up with the world, as opposed to argue about things, although I do occasionally these days get drawn into an argument. But I've also, as I've gotten older, started thinking about how I use my time. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you tend to think of as you get older, that, my time is limited and I can't engage with every troll, nor do I want to. And I would rather spend my time, rather than arguing, just as an example, rather than arguing endlessly with someone who doesn't think racism is systemic in our society, I'd rather spend my time engaging with people who are fighting systemic racism and doing really creative, constructive things to undermine that worldview and create a new world. Occasionally I might wade into that water if I feel a person's open or, receptive, but man, life's too short to.
Yeah. No, I mean, so that is, I mean, the reason that people often have a kind of dissatisfying experience online is kind of twofold. One, they bring with it the expectations of other parts of their lives. So they kind of expect it to function exactly like every other part of their lives. And I think many of us have felt that this year in particular, when, in the pandemic, we've had to sort of move big pieces of our lives online. And, if we expect it to sort of function exactly the same as other parts of our lives, we'll be disappointed. But if we look at it as providing, as being a shift that certainly includes loss, but also enables things that weren't possible before, like you and I can have a conversation right now in a way that we couldn't, before. then I think that helps. But I also think the time piece is, one of the biggest parts of it, because, the apps that have the sort of, there was a study that Moment did, and they sort of ranked the apps that people had the most negative views of. And, a lot of it has to do with whether or not people feel like they've sort of been sucked in and wasted their time as a result. And it does have so much to do with, the fact that our time feels precious. And so, if we can use it in ways that feel life-giving, to use a term that is a holdover from my days in Christianity.
But also, I think, poignant, though. Yeah.
I mean, I know that you and I share this, but I was deeply shaped by reading Martin Haglin's book, This Life.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it was one of those books that articulated a lot of what I already felt, but also gave me, so much in terms of helping me be able to articulate sort of why I value certain things, why they matter to me.
Same.
And time is a big piece of it. It's exactly as you were saying about, as you get older, you recognize that your time is really, it's one of the most important things that you have. It's one of the most valuable things you have, and how you spend it really matters. And I think, because we are not encouraged, certainly not by the platforms themselves, and also kind of by the discourse or the narrative that the internet is not real or is less real. We're not encouraged to be sort of reflective on our digital lives. I mean, we all spend a ton of time thinking about them, but we don't, we're not encouraged to sort of see them as being, spaces where we can actually spend meaningful time, even though we constantly are. And so that, that shift in my sort of approach to my digital life has made a big difference in trying to be more aware of what needs I'm actually trying to meet when I log on, rather than having it be this thing that's sort of seamlessly integrated into every part of my life. And it does, it goes back to exactly what you were saying. So when I decided I wanted to try to better understand how we're using the internet to explore these sort of age-old questions of what it means to be human, which is not the book that I thought I was going to write when I first sort of was thinking about writing a book, and really was a result of kind of two things, which from reading the book. One, these kind of personal experiences I had where I was going through these immense changes in my life, but was kind of continuing to post online as if it was sort of business as usual. And I was feeling this kind of split. I was feeling like there are certain things that I can't bring to my digital life, and I want to understand why. But then I was also working with these sociologists at the University of Minnesota, and one has now moved to UMass Boston to study the religiously unaffiliated, and was feeling more and more like a lot of the work that has happened in religious spaces historically is now happening online. And so when I decided I wanted to try and understand this better, sort of how we use the internet to explore these fundamental questions about what it means to be human, I actually started that search by going to a map library, which again, and I think, I had a few people be like, well, why there?
Why maps?
Part of it is because I've always loved maps. I was a geography nerd as a kid, but it's also because, it's, sort of exactly like you were saying, just as when I was a kid, I looked at maps and I saw them as these sort of neutral or artless representations of a space, that were literally just documenting a space, like, a news channel just telling the news. I think I didn't realize, or I know I didn't realize, that actually, maps represent the interests of power, the people who sort of decide what matters, what's worth representing. A map is a process of sort of representation and subtraction. You have to sort of decide what you're going to show on the map and what you're not, because it can't be the size of the territory it's trying to depict, or it can't show every detail on the territory because it would be the size of the territory. And that those decisions aren't just sort of neutral choices. They represent various interests. And similarly, online, I think sometimes we feel like we're just logging on and using the internet, but actually the internet that we're using is one that's shaped by particular interests and that moves us in certain directions and doesn't move us in others. And until we, are sort of more aware of that stuff and sort of more aware of what we're trying to do online and what needs we're trying to meet, I think we will find ourselves having more of those feelings, after time online, that the time has been not well spent. It's not moving us in the direction of feeling more real, feeling more fully human, and is instead moving us in directions that we don't always like, or at least that's been my experience. But I don't think that the outcome is set. I think we have some agency. We can have a say in the internet that we have, both on an individual level and again on a systemic level.
Yeah, and to pick up on something that you mentioned a little bit earlier, you used the analogy of recycling, which is one I often use as well. I just read the other day that, this article that said, for a long time now, waste management companies have just been burning our recycling along with all the rest of the trash, just like, oh my God. So the question I wanted to ask you was about sort of individual versus collective solutions. And, and rightly so, like a lot of your book is talking about what I can do as a reader of your book to have a better experience online, to really understand myself and my own impulses and my own desires and why I'm behaving the way I am and how I might think differently about my online life as a real life, as something that I bring my whole real self to. But I also wonder about the role society has to play in these platforms. I'm sure, we all remember that article. It was on multiple platforms, but I remember one especially in the New York Times about the YouTube algorithm and how it radicalizes people to extreme right-wing ideologies. You start with, not to name
Sam Harris.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Let's just. You start with Sam Harris because you're interested in, like, I don't know, meditation or you're having a struggle with religion, and you heard that this guy knew something about religion and its role in society, and so you listen to that, and the next thing you hear is Joe Rogan, and then it's Jordan Peterson, and the next thing you know, it's Mike Cernovich or whatever, and off you go into the far right, and then, along with that comes the questions about free speech and censorship and private corporations having such a control. And you've talked a little bit about capitalism already, that how dangerous it is to have private corporations that aren't beholden to the public interest in control of so much of our mouthpieces, the sources of our information. And of course, it brings to mind questions around cancel culture as well, like the way that certain voices are removed from certain platforms because they are so toxic, and these corporations, even though they are in the pursuit of profit, have determined that either in the service of public interest or maybe in service of their profit, that certain people are not allowed to be on these platforms anymore. Do you have any sense of like where we're headed in terms of a completely open and free society where anything can be posted at any time on any platform, whether it's blatant anti-Semitism or racism, and the role of sort of moderating these forums and how complicated that seems to me?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, you may remember, I know you do, that a few years ago, I got some shit for basically, talking about that, about the sort of gateways to the alt-right. Through the atheist community online, which is a problem that I certainly am not the only person to recognize, nor the first. And there are a lot of people who've been doing a lot more about it. But I felt a responsibility to say something, given my my sort of position in the community, especially as a white cisgender man. And it's something that I think a lot of people in the community either didn't want to acknowledge or didn't have to acknowledge. For years I got some really vicious homophobia from fellow atheists that I think a lot of people just couldn't believe that would actually happen. They sort of didn't really believe that was true. Anyway, that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think in some ways, I think part of what drew me to writing this book is the same, a lot of what drew me to writing Faithiest, which is that, I had sort of the best and the worst experiences with religion. I had experiences of immense alienation, experiences that caused me to, that did sort of immense damage to my sense of self. But I also had experiences of finding communities of immense welcoming. Those progressive Lutheran communities I moved into really were my safe space in high school. When I came out, I came out in a large high school where there were not other visibly LGBT people, and experienced a lot of harassment and targeted, bullying as a result of that. And then I would go to these churches and I would find these, I would have this experience of immense acceptance and welcoming. And so, I felt like I had seen sort of the best and the worst of religion, and that gave me a way to approach it, sort of recognizing both its, the very real challenges that living in a religiously pluralistic society alongside people who have, very anti-pluralistic mindsets present. Mm-hmm. And so, I think it's hard for me to write about anything unless I sort of am equally sort of in love and terrified by it. And I think the internet functions in that way for me. I mean, I think some of the greatest, most connective experiences I've had have come through my digital life, and some of the worst, experiences have as well. And so, I'm not, when it comes to sort of cultural criticism on the internet, there tend to be these two really broad categories: the apocalyptics and the utopians. The people who say that the internet is full of promise and it's going to make us, more effective or more efficient, better versions of ourselves, superhumans, transhumanist views. And then there's, the sort of apocalyptics who are all doom and gloom about it. And, I think I started this project much like I think I sort of started with religion when I became an atheist. I started, much more kind of at least sympathetic to the doom and gloom perspective, and have kind of landed more in the middle of saying, there are huge challenges, but also huge opportunities here. It's about sort of the choices that we make both individually and collectively, which I'll kind of come back to that in a second. But I've also come to feel that it's not just about being sort of utilitarian about it. I also think that the newness of our digital lives, the fact that it's such a new thing in the sort of scope of human history, presents an opportunity for us a unique opportunity for us to reapproach these age-old questions and do them in new ways. I opened the book talking about a drag show and going on amateur night when drag performers are sort of just dipping their toes in the water. And on amateur night, you see people trying all kinds of different things that don't work. And yet you also see in that sort of, in trying to do something new, you see people learning about themselves, sort of trying things that someone who is maybe a more seasoned performer wouldn't try, thinking less about sort of how do I do this well and more about what am I trying to say? What are the sort of things that are driving me into this? And I think, in online, we're all amateurs, right? We're all sort of trying to do something that we're not good at yet. But in that process, we have an opportunity to, try new things, new ways of being, new ways of belonging. And so, and I also think to sort of come back to this collective versus individual question, part of why I write, my first book also takes a sort of more individual approach to religious difference, to say like, yes, there are these sort of immense cultural factors when it comes to religious difference that makes it really hard to navigate. But here are choices we can sort of make on an individual level that will, sort of have an effect, on the sort of broader issues. And I think, so I do think we have a lot of power as individuals. I think all sort of social movements start on an individual level. But I also think that the challenges that we face, whether it comes to religion, sort of open internet, stuff like that, are so broad that it can feel absolutely overwhelming to know what to do. I can't do anything as an individual about, so much of climate change, but I can make choices on an individual level. And some of it's just about, making me feel okay enough to keep going, which matters. It does matter. But also, it's if enough of us start sort of taking a more mindful approach to the internet, that's going to have, I think, a huge effect on the kind of internet that we have. And you know me, politically, I'm a Democratic socialist, and I believe that collectively, we, that change has to happen on a systemic level, but that sort of starts. I think a lot more is accomplished in local politics than in sort of national politics.
Yes,
and so I think we can start where we are, start trying to kind of foster a more mindful internet where we are in our communities, with our friends, with our neighbors, with the people that we engage with online. And, I'm not some sort of wide-eyed optimist, especially not this year. I don't think that if we all just make a change, then that will magically fix everything. I think we are, a lot of this change is going to come through, legal avenues, but I also think that we're not powerless, and that we can make change where we are. So,
no, that's helpful. I don't have no idea where this is going. Whether we collectively decide, as in a democratic way, that certain voices are just simply too toxic to tolerate. Sort of as Germans have made illegal the Sig Heil, because of obvious reasons, or whether we just sort of say it's a free for all, choose who you listen to. I have no idea.
The thing is, like, there is this false dichotomy, and I know this, between sort of this idea that free speech means kind of like anything can be said with no sort of consequences whatsoever. And there are consequences to what people say, and sometimes those consequences include not having access to various platforms. I remember when I was directing the humanist community at Yale, the conservative group on campus decided to invite Ayaan Hirsi Ali to speak on campus, and the student groups, I think 30 or 40 student groups, decided to come together and put their names all on a letter, sort of decrying that decision, not even asking, for her to be deplatformed, but they sort of wanted to say, we have real concerns about this. We'd like to see another voice, sort of be able to give a response or something like that.
Right.
And you probably remember when this happened, and the whole world swarmed on these students, and in particular our students with the atheist and humanist group, who made their own choice to sign on to that letter. They didn't even tell me until after they'd already done it. I had nothing to do with that at all, but they sort of, in particular, folks really focused on our students for doing that, even though the efforts among our student group were in fact led by ex-Muslim students themselves, which just, it shows that people, can get this little bit out of context, know nothing about what's going on, and decide that their opinion matters most. But,
right.
I think that's a great example of, Yale, speaking at Yale is not this sort of right that anyone can have. Like, yes. Students can say, we don't want our money going to support this speaker. And likewise, the internet is not this sort of, just free for all, or it functions that way, but it's it is something that we collectively sort of are building together. Yes, these private companies sort of own these platforms and set the conventions and the norms, but the internet is like any society, any community. It's something that's collaboratively built, and we not only have the right to say these voices are not voices that contribute to the public good, and in fact harm, have very real material harm that they cause. But I think we have a responsibility to moderate ourselves, to say this is the kind of internet that we want, or this is not the kind of. And so, I think it's an immensely complicated thing. What I'm saying right now is not a solution to that question, but this idea that it's simply a matter of free speech. And if you ever sort of suggest that somebody's speech is harmful, is reckless, is dangerous, your anti-free speech is just, it's such a miscasting of what free speech actually means.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. And I just, the time has just flown by, and there's so much more we could talk. No, not at all. There's so much more we could talk about, and maybe we can do that in the future. I would love to come back and kind of go deeper on some of the things that you talk about. You reference some of my favorite philosophers, one being Charles Taylor, and his notion of the sources of the self. And I would love to talk more about how how media in general, and then the advent of social media is furthering that process of us sort of understanding who we are, and the fragmentation within ourselves, or maybe some cohesion, So anyway, that's a fascinating subject to me. And
and I think and I'll keep this very succinct because I know we're up at the end of time here, but one of the things that the internet and sort of reflecting more on my digital life has revealed to me, which I write in the book, like I think one of both the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities that social media presents is that we've always been the selves sort of partitioned into different selves, right? Like the person I am on this podcast is not the same person I am with my boyfriend, with my mom, online. And it's not as if these are sort of any one of these selves is more real than the other, or, that they're false. It's, we've always been a kind of composite of selves. The challenge of the internet is that, when we're posting on social media, we have to be a self that is somehow coherent to all of these different kind of audiences that we've always had, future coworkers, colleagues, parents, etc. And that's sort of impossible. And so the internet reveals that we've always been these sort of fragmented selves, or we've always been, a self divided. And we can either embrace that, which I think the internet presents an opportunity to do so, or we can be at war with ourselves, which I think we often feel like we are. But yeah, I agree. That's definitely something we could dive into more in depth at a future date. I'd love to do that.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. The book is IRL, In Real Life, Finding Realness, Meaning, and Belonging in Our Digital Lives. Chris, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found Chris's story helpful in understanding how we are each reaching for a deeper sense of identity in multiple ways and in multiple dimensions. You're listening to a podcast, so I'm going to assume that you spend at least some of your time online. Perhaps you're minimally involved, sharing a few things on Facebook and commenting on a few friends' posts. Or maybe you're maximally involved on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and whatever else is out there. The biggest takeaway for me, though, after reading Chris's book, is that our online lives are real life. It's a different form of life, but it's still my life, and the time I spend and the way I spend that time affects me and others just as the time I spend in other ways. I'm trying to be more aware of how I use the internet and how the internet may be using me, and I hope maybe some of these thoughts will provoke similar feelings for you. I highly recommend Chris's book, so please go out, buy it, and read it. The links are in the show notes. Wherever you're listening to this, all you have to do is look in the notes and click on the link, and it'll take you to a place where you can buy his book. Thanks again for tuning in and listening to the show. Next time I'll be sharing a conversation that I had with Victoria De La Torre and Margaret Downey. We talk about Secular Day of the Dead, which they co-created. Until then, my name is Ryan Bell, and this has been the Life After God podcast.